Did you miss it back in February? World Hijab Day? It's not a particularly venerable feature of our calendar. In fact, it's little more than a decade since some bright spark thought what the world really needed was a day set aside every year to celebrate women wearing an Islamic headscarf. Of course, there were many women, perhaps millions of them in Iran, for instance, who were not celebrating. For them, the headscarf is a symbol not of religious zeal, but of subjugation by and submission to controlling men. These awareness days are now coming thick and fast. Unlike many of our old feast days or saints' days, they are not the product of traditions going back deep into our folk memory or Christian heritage. They are modern confections. I don't think it's stretching a point to say they are, in fact, an attempt to hijack the calendar for the purposes of propaganda. Because that's what it is, isn't it? When one group decides to dress up an idea as universally welcome, like wearing the hijab, when in fact lots of people think it's a daft idea. But it's also now very much part of the playbook of activism. Take this month. There are some red-letter days you'll recognise. The anniversary of D-Day has been and gone, Father's Day, the King's birthday, the summer solstice, but also some you might not recognise. Anyone for National Forklift Safety Day or National Heimlich Manoeuvre Day. You may have missed them. But there is one of these new artificially created awareness days which is increasingly hard to ignore because our government insists that you take notice whether you want to or not. In fact, the British state now spends £500,000 of taxpayers' cash every year to ensure you celebrate, as in you will celebrate, this not-so-ancient festival. The date in question is June the 22nd. Does that date ring any bells? A couple of years ago, the Imperial War Museum called it one of the foundational moments in British history. June the 22nd was the eve of the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, when Robert the Bruce defeated proud Edward's army and sent him homewards to think again. Was that what the Imperial War Museum had in mind when they said June the 22nd was a foundational moment in British history? Or perhaps it was the execution in 1535 of Cardinal John Fisher, beheaded for denying the right of Henry VIII to establish his own Church of England. Was that what the partly taxpayer-funded Imperial War Museum meant by a foundational moment in British history? Now, I'm afraid neither of these historical punctuation marks qualifies as foundational to the British state anymore, because for our government, the only thing of real note that ever happened on June the 22nd happened in 1948, when a ship from the Caribbean docked at Tilbury Docks, the Empire Windrush. The 802 West Indian men who disembarked from the Windrush could never have imagined that within a few decades there would be coins struck by the Royal Mint commemorating their landfall, statues erected in their honour, songs sung, poems penned, portraits painted. In 2023, to mark the 75th anniversary of what by now we were told to call Windrush Day, Prince William made a speech in which he said of those 802 men and those who followed them that their contribution to Britain cannot be overstated. Well, it certainly couldn't be overstated by the Prime Minister. Last year on Twitter, Keir Starmer wrote that this government will never forget the legacy of the Windrush generation who laid the foundations for modern Britain. Laid the foundations for modern Britain. Don't know about you, but that sounds to me a bit like overstating things. By saying the foundations of modern Britain were laid by the Windrush generation is to willfully ignore, in my opinion, quite a few other folk. Starmer and those who share his monomaniacal vision want to create a new founding myth for this country, that Britain was built by diversity, not by white people at the looms and furnaces of the Industrial Revolution, or mono-ethnic masons patiently raising cathedrals over centuries, or pale-skinned peasants building hundreds of thousands of miles of dry stone walls to pen in the sheep that made medieval England an economic powerhouse, or the Celtic slaves who made our straight Roman roads. Not Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution, or the common law, not Dunkirk or the harrying of the North or the Civil War, not the King James Bible, the Book of Common Prayer or Shakespeare. No, diversity built Britain. Until 1952, Britain was the richest nation that this planet had ever seen. So if the Windrush did change everything in 1948, if diversity really did build Britain, it didn't make a particularly good fist of it. We are very far now from being the richest nation on earth. But we insist that Windrush was a windfall, one for which we must be grateful and for which we show our gratitude, even at the cost of a few bob. Take the Windrush line, a train route in London, renamed in 2024 as part of a £6.3 million rebranding exercise of over half a dozen overland lines. It seemed to me odd, as someone whose great-grandparents came to England from County Mayo in the 19th century, that none of these train lines in the capital was named after the Irish labourers, the navvies, who actually built them. And this is part of the problem with the elevation of one immigrant group to semi-mythical status above others. I grew up in Bradford, not far from a Ukrainian church. Elsewhere in the city there were Poles, there were Hungarians and Czechs who arrived in their thousands during or after World War II. Like the Windrush generation, they arrived to fill post-war job vacancies. But why is it then that RPM singles out Caribbeans as having laid the foundations for modern Britain, rather than Irish canal diggers or Polish farmhands or Indian doctors, who might just as well have named one of those rebadged overland lines after the coach station in London to Victoria? After all, that's where thousands of Eastern Europeans arrived after 2004, many of them doing jobs that native Brits didn't much fancy anymore. Where's their statue? This naming of things, whether it's a railway line or an official day in the calendar, this is how social engineering works. Something dressed up as spontaneous and organic and grassroots, but actually very much the work of a top-down guiding mind. And the question it poses when you see it happening so blatantly is why? What's the thinking behind it? Does the state protest too much that Caribbean immigration has been a miracle to avoid engaging with the nuanced, complicated, delicate notion that West Indian immigration had downsides as well as upsides? In an article for Unheard last year, Rakib Hassan came up with one answer. He wrote, "Compared to black Caribbeans, the Indian and Irish ethnic groups fare much better in terms of family stability, educational attainment, socio-economic achievement and respecting the rule of law. Yet their post-war migrants are not celebrated to the same extent as the Windrush generation, despite paving the way for intergenerational success." In other words, we are overemphasising the contribution made to British life by Caribbeans because if we were being totally honest and empirical about that contribution, we might not find everything to our liking. Do we exaggerate one side of the ledger because the other side, record rates of single parenthood, for instance, is not so attractive? So what is it then that makes the Windrush generation so special? Is it because, as we are instructed to believe, they answered the call of a Britain reeling from World War II to drive the buses and nurse the sick, because native Britons were no longer there to do so, having been mown down by the German war machine for a second time in less than 30 years? This is certainly what the myth makers want us to think. As the words of a poem formerly given pride of place on a concourse at Waterloo Station in London put it, "Remember you called, remember you called, you called. Remember it was us who came." As a former student of English literature, I have to tell you this is not the greatest poem you will ever read. But it is informative, inadvertently, because it tells us something about an idea that has taken hold, that the Windrush generation sort of took pity on a battered Britain and answered our entreaties to come and save us. It's poetic fiction, and it's really bad history. In reality, almost everything you think you know about the Empire Windrush is wrong. For one thing, that wasn't really the ship's name. She actually began life as the Monte Rosa, German troop carrier. When the ship sailed into British waters in 1948, she was escorted by a warship, HMS Sheffield, lest the Caribbean passengers on board should make trouble. Far from West Indians first and foremost answering Britain's pleas for help, most were looking to improve their personal financial circumstances. Perfectly reasonable behaviour. In the same situation, many of us would do the same, exchanging the limited opportunities of Caribbean island life for the massive economic canvas of the British Isles. But that's not how we present this chapter in history, is it? We choose, or our political, media and NGO complex chooses, to present the motives of those who came here in an almost philanthropic, self-sacrificial light. Again, there's nothing ignoble in moving somewhere to improve your career prospects. People do it all the time. And lately, not least because of the highest tax burden since the war, record numbers of Britons have left this country in pursuit mainly of money. Last year, 642,000 Britons left the UK for countries like Australia and Canada. That's a third more leaving than were heading abroad 5 years ago. According to a survey published in the papers this month, for most of them, it's about cash. The ruler of the United Arab Emirates, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, doesn't feel the need to tell British expats piling into his condos and staffing his low-tax shopping malls that Dubai called and the British came, that without them Dubai might still be little more than a desert oasis. We are talking here whether it's today's wannabe influencers heading for the Gulf or young men 80 years ago with a berth on the Windrush, hoping to improve their lot. We're talking about economic migrants. If that sounds shocking, transgressive, or iconoclastic, then it is a mark of how well the Windrush myth weavers have done their job. Rational actors making deliberate choices about where to advance their lives. It is true of every young person who this year packs a bag and heads off to work in New Zealand or Saudi, and it was just as true for the Windrush generation, who we now uniquely valorise. As the conservative writer Ed West has made clear, the idea that Britain begged the Windrush generation to come here is junk. In 1948, Labour, I repeat, Labour backbenchers told the then Prime Minister Clement Attlee that they had serious misgivings about the plan for immigration from the Caribbean at all. And the idea that even after the war there was a chronic shortage of workers is not entirely true either. In fact, there was a surplus, which is why between 1946 and 1960, getting on for 2 million Brits left the UK and were given subsidised travel to countries like Australia. Even without them, unemployment rates remained fairly stable, so there was no massive labour crunch. Although individual businesses might have encouraged immigration from the Caribbean, that wasn't the official position. The government's own colonial office sent civil servants, sent them to the West Indies there to organise campaigns aiming to dissuade people from boarding ships bound for Britain. They explained that the streets were not paved with gold, jobs were scarce, rationing was a fact of life. It went on until 1954, and there was no guarantee you'd find a home because native Britons were struggling to do so. This was a time when cities like London were still rebuilding the housing stock after the Blitz. You may wonder why then, given that the British state didn't seem keen on immigration from the Caribbean, why it was allowed to happen at all. The answer is it couldn't be stopped, because of a change in the law which few foresaw having the impact it did. What happened was that as the curtain came down on the British Empire, individual nations, or dominions as they were called, wanted to know what independence meant for their peoples. The 1948 Nationality Act effectively gave the new citizens of what would become known as Commonwealth countries British citizenship. Even if the British government wanted to stop the Windrush pioneers, they had no legal leg to stand on. The doors to Britain remained open until the early 1970s, when new laws were drafted to curb migration from the Caribbean, but also South Asia, which was running at rates nobody could have predicted, with the possible exception of Enoch Powell. None of this is to denigrate the work of people, whatever their colour, who have come to Britain to work and make Britain a better place, to make all our lives better. But it is to point out that almost every single person who has come here has not come out of some altruistic desire to make the UK a happier country. They have come entirely reasonably, first and foremost, to feather their own nest. Which is why this overstating of the contribution made by one group of migrants, the Windrush generation and their descendants, sets teeth on edge and the rational values of the Enlightenment backwards. Why am I saying any of this? Is it because I don't like West Indians? Am I perhaps a closet racist? I'm not. But I am suspicious of social engineering, particularly when it's funded at the taxpayer's expense, and I'm very much in favour of giving people the means to see through the state's attempts to gild the lily when it comes to migration. You might think there is no harm in lionising one group of migrants, the Windrush generation, even if that risks neglecting other contributions, say from Ireland or India, because it all happened quite a long time ago now. But the problem with that analysis is that it ignores what is happening today and what will happen tomorrow. The Windrush myth is merely the leading edge of a bigger ideological project to insist that diversity built Britain, not just with the arrival of the first Caribbeans in 1948, but throughout British history. We see it in attempts to depict Britain as forever diverse in films, TV and adverts. It's there in claims that the Neolithics who built Stonehenge were not white. It'll be there in Black History Month in October, another one of those calendar colonisations. It's there in history programmes for children on the BBC with themes like Been Here from the Start. As with the Windrush myth, it's not out-and-out wrong to imagine a handful of non-white Britons populating our island story, but the makers of these shows want to create an impression on impressionable minds that ancient Britain, Roman Britain, medieval Britain, Georgian Britain, Victorian Britain were not really all that very different from today's multicultural country. They want, I think, to encourage non-white Britons to feel that this is their country too. It's a laudable, really laudable goal. It's about making people feel they belong. Always have been included in our history. But it's an outrageous exaggeration, bordering on an outright lie. And a society built on a lie is inherently susceptible to fracture under pressure. Again, my problem with this is that it is over-egging the case and doing so to achieve an ideological end, namely to make everyone think diversity built Britain, and to question that, as I'm doing right now, is somehow mean, probably bigoted. This normalisation of historic diversity is not victimless. There have to be posthumous sacrifices. If Britain really was diverse back then, any official depictions now of a too-white Britain become inappropriate. Which is why I would argue we learned this month that the Bank of England was ditching white faces from its banknotes, our banknotes. Images of Winston Churchill and Jane Austen were, according to the Daily Telegraph, contentious and not representative of the UK's cultural and natural diversity. They would be replaced instead by depictions of animals, for whom race isn't an issue. It's why comparative historical non-entities receive star billings. You cannot big up Mary Seacole without taking some of the gloss off Florence Nightingale. You might disagree with my analysis, but might we not all at least accept that a country incapable of cohering around individuals who have shaped its history is not a nation at ease with itself? Last week the World Cup kicked off, and I predict that for some activists this will provide another opportunity to point out, as they have before, that diversity built Britain, or at least that without it England's footballing fortunes would be less rosy. We've seen it before. Posters insisting that an England team without immigration would be hollowed out and missing star quality. This is a really reductive message on multiple levels. It suggests, if you think about it, that some of these players, often mixed race, are not somehow fully English, that what defines them is their otherness. It suggests whatever problems are thrown up by immigration, it's all right, because the footy's better. It's a sort of thin argument for multiculturalism that leaves its apologists citing chicken tikka masala as something that made mass migration worthwhile. And it infers, as with the Windrush mythologising, that you should be grateful because these positions, whether that's driving a bus or driving into the penalty box, are done for king and country and no other reason. Well, I'm sure the England players who campaigners claim as exemplars of migration would turn out for the national side if the World Cup was an amateur tournament and they had to pay for their own flights to get there. But in reality, playing for England at the World Cup never made anybody poorer. It's demeaning to the players when activists co-opt them for a puerile campaign pushing the benefits of migration. It's insulting to the rest of us to suggest that World Cup glory achieved in 1966 with less diversity is a justification for the complete ethnic transformation of Britain. The Windrush generation myth and the associated diversity delusion stop us seeing things clearly. It will be why, later this summer, anyone who expresses doubts about the Notting Hill Carnival in London will be dismissed as insufficiently inclusive and probably a bit prejudiced. But it's perfectly reasonable to ask whether the carnival is worth the candle, or the £10 million it costs to host, which doesn't, by the way, include the cost to the dozens of businesses and homes that have to be boarded up for that bank holiday weekend in August. It's perfectly reasonable to ask if more than 400 arrests, the number was up a fifth last year, is a price worth paying. All the murders, the stabbings, the sexual assaults. Last year, the Police Federation, that's the police officers' trades union, likened working at the carnival for the 7,000 officers we pay to do so to being in a war zone, the UK. A third of officers reported having been hit or spat at. Last year, more than 50 emergency workers were assaulted. Any reasonable conversation about this festival of thuggery would conclude either with its complete cancellation or transferal to a park where it could be more effectively and cheaply policed. But that will not happen, in part because the Notting Hill Carnival has become a sort of sacred space. Sacred, that is, if you believe in the Windrush myth, because Notting Hill, along with places like Brixton in South London, is where many first-generation West Indians settled. It may now be home to battalions of bankers and Eurotrash millionaires, but the place is central to the story of young Caribbean men coming to England to do jobs the English didn't want to do, facing racism in the process and generally putting themselves out for the good of Blighty. Bits of that story are true. Yes, they did do jobs, some jobs in sectors where there were labour shortages. Yes, they did occasionally face bigotry, as did the Irish and the Indians, but they didn't come here as missionaries or moral superheroes. They came for work, for a better life. They definitely did not lay the foundations for modern Britain. And to pretend they did is to perform an act of cultural self-loathing. Ours is an old country, millennia in the making. And to insist that we would be somehow lost without the Windrush generation is a kind of folly close to being demented. Worse than that, the Windrush myth has made it difficult to have complex conversations about race, to draw distinctions, as I think we must learn to, between migrants who bring something valuable to Britain and those who bring the opposite, or somewhere in between. This month, as events in Belfast have reminded us, not every foreigner who comes to the UK brings or arrives with values which will make us stronger as a United Kingdom. To Keir Starmer and all those who insist that June the 22nd, 1948 was a great leap forward, by all means, insert an artificial day of remembrance into our calendar for Windrush Day if you must. Make it an unofficial day of celebration for the benefits of immigration if you like. Make us pay for it if you have to. But don't think the majority of us believe in your glib, obligatory celebration of diversity. As with the Notting Hill Carnival, we've learned to be sceptical. We're familiar with the attractions of smiling dancers and steel bands and jerk chicken. But we also know about the stabbings, the drugs and the sex crimes. Because immigration is complicated, it gives and it takes. And we no longer believe in fairy stories about the Empire Windrush. Bye for now. At Outpost, we are committed to free speech and shining a light on untold stories that matter. To support our documentaries, reports and podcasts, please like, share and subscribe to our work on Substack, YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.